Hello everyone, I cordially welcome you all to another video from the React tutorial series, and in this video we are going to learn render props in React. So without any delay, let's get started. So what are render props in React? So before we speak about render props, let us discuss what are props. In React, prop stands for properties. It is an object where the value of attributes of a tag is stored. Props are like arguments of functions in JavaScript or like that of attributes in HTML. Props are read-only in nature and thus they shouldn't be mutated. So if you are not sure what are props and if you don't know how to implement them, I will suggest you to watch one of our previous videos where we have discussed in detail what are props and how we should implement them. Now let's come to the main topic for this video. The term render prop in React is a technique for sharing code between React components using a prop whose value is a function. In React, we can pass a function from the parent component to its child component as a render prop, and the child component invokes that function which is passed to it instead of implementing its own render logic. A render prop actually tells the child component what to render in the DOM. Basically, till now what we have seen, parent component can pass some data to their child component and the child component can render some data on the UI. This basically helps us to increase the code reusability. But one more thing is also possible. The parent component can tell the child component what to render. Basically, the parent component can dictate the render method of the child component. The child component may not or may or partially may implement its own render logic. So here in this video, we are going to learn about render props and how to implement them. Basically what we will learn is how from parent component we can decide what to render within the child component. So enough of theory now, let's go to the VS Code and understand by an example. Welcome to the VS Code, and here we are going to learn about the implementation of render props in React both using class component and function component. In the website I have only given the class component part, but here I have also included the function component because we have got some mails that please explain how to implement render props using functional components. It's pretty simple, but still I will walk an extra mile to explain this a bit further. First of all, what did I just say? I said that render props basically helps parent component to dictate the render logic of the child component. Okay, so if you are familiar with props, what I will explain you now will be a cakewalk. So let's start with the class component. So first of all, in the class component we have named it as index.cc, and here you will see I have one folder or directory named render prop. Within it I have two files, index.cc and index.fc. CC is for the class component implementation and FC is for the function component implementation. This is my standard way of teaching. So you can name it as anything you want. So in the class component, we have imported React from React. Thereafter, we have created an interface iData which contains a property render UI which will be a type of function. Then we have created our class component and named it as render prop component. And if you have watched our videos on class component, you know how to create a basic class component in React. Basically, we say class, then the name of the class, followed by extends react.component, because our class component should extend the properties of React component class. Thereafter, we specify the type of props and the type of state data. Here we are using props, so I have specified the props received will be of type iData, basically of this interface. Thereafter, within the render method, we have our return, which returns a piece of JSX code which will be rendered on the UI. So within the div container fluid, I have an h1 tag which says within render props class component, and here we call the render UI method which is passed to it as a prop. Okay. And now you might ask, what will be this render UI? Will it result a simple value or something else? So in our parent app.tsx, we see when we call this render prop component, we pass the render UI prop value as a function, and this function basically returns a small JSX where within h3 tag we say I am from render props. So if everything works perfectly on the UI, we should see first within render props class component, and thereafter under it, as we are calling this render UI method which is passed to it as props, we should see this thing, I am from render props exclamation. Okay, so let's run our code and see if it is working. So firstly we will go to terminal and write npm start to run our React application. Let's wait for some time until our application starts. So as you can see, as expected, we see within render props class component. This is basically generated from the class component itself. But I am from render props, this is basically the return value of the render UI function which is passed as a prop to the child component. Okay. So as per our expectation, things are working pretty fine. Our h1 tag is basically coming first. Thereafter it calls this method which is received as props, and this method basically in return the JSX code within this h3 tag. So our code is working. Now let's go back to the code and understand how we can implement the same thing using function components. So in case of function components, again it is very simple and very much like your class component. And if you are already familiar with props, this is basically a cakewalk. Even some of you might have already guessed. We have defined an interface likewise, iData, which will contain a property render UI which should be of type function. Thereafter we have made our child component as render props fc, which is a function component. It receives props which will be of type iData. And within here, we destructured the render UI method from props. As we are using function component, so you already know we don't write this keyword here. So when we have destructured this render UI method here, similarly within this container fluid, within h1 tag I have written within render props function component, and just below it I have called the render UI method. And similarly we will invoke the index fc's class component, that is render props fc component, from our parent component. I will do nothing here, just replace this cc with fc. Basically now it will invoke the render prop component from the child component of this index fc, that is the render props fc, and then it will do as like we have done in the previous example. So first of all within h1 we will see within render props function component, below it will call this render UI method which is received as props, and this render UI will in return this JSX, that is I am from render props. So if everything works, we should see the output as I have just said. So again let's run our application. So as you see, just like the previous one, we are getting the same UI on our browser. But a small difference, here I have set from class component and here I have set from function component. Basically just to have a little different output on our UI. Okay. So this is very simple, though it is not highly used in production grade application, but sometimes you may need to use it, and this will increase your component reusability. Okay. Let's go back to our slide. I hope you found this video informative. In case you like it, feel free to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We are going to bring more videos in the future. For any queries, doubts, suggestions or feedbacks, feel free to post them in the comment section. We are going to reply. So thank you for now. See you in the next video. Bye.